Welcome to something a little bit different for BBB, a little bit of a break from the norm of the interviews, the podcast chats, all that sort of thing we normally do. Thought we'd have a little look at the previous batch of Olympians. We've got this current, almost recent crop looking to turn pro. A few have already announced their intentions with the McCormack twins from our neck of the woods signing with Probellum. We've got the likes of Lauren Price, Ben Whitaker, sort of rumoured with a few promoters, but nothing set in stone as yet. So obviously a lot of hype around these, and there's a lot of prestige around Olympic medalists. Obviously Galal Yafai coming back with the gold, a few others, to be thinking about and to keep your eye on over the next few years. But with all that in mind, we thought we'll take a little bit of a look back and have a look at the class of 2016, the lads and lasses coming back from Rio, turning pro, we're talking 5 or 6 years ago now, and have a little look where they are now and what they've achieved so far in the paid ranks, where their futures lie, and as a little bit of a back to school theme, I thought we'll give them a grade as well. So hopefully we'll provoke a little bit of thought, give you something to think about and discuss. For those of you who are in this for the long haul, this will be put together as one long video, but we'll also break it up in each individual fighter if you've got an attention span like I do. Nice little 5 minutes or so chunks on each fighter. So without further ado, we will start at the top. We'll go from heavyweight and we'll work our way down through the weight classes. I'll give my thoughts on what they've done so far as professionals, and we'll put a little bit of a grading on there as well. Drop a comment below, however you're watching or listening to this, whether you agree, whether you disagree. If you think, as you may well do, that I am way off with my judging, we will see. As I said, start with the heavyweight himself, or super heavyweight as he was in the Olympics in the amateur code. We've got Joe the Juggernaut Joyce. Record there, 13 wins, no defeats. That's fairly impressive on paper anyway, but I think what you've got to do with Joe is look a little bit more at that and see why it's so impressive. Being a little bit older, they have pushed him and progressed him through the paid ranks quite quickly. I think you look no further than his debuts, chucked in with Ian Lewison, not your normal 4-rounder. He's been put in there in a long contest. They've got no issue. His management, his promotion side of things, no issue putting him in there with challenges. And already, less than 15 fights in, he's had a very, very fast introduction to the paid ranks. Very, very competitive matchmaking, as much as you can. You want him to learn on the job. He's a very experienced fighter. I think you'll just have to look at some of his wins compared to other heavyweights with even more fights than he has. There's some faded world names on there, like Bermane Stiverne. He's gone through, he's picked up the Commonwealth title very early on in his career, dismantling Roy Thomas. Some very impressive performances, and none more so than the Daniel Dubois fight. That was one that many people were picking against him. It was a tough fight for him. He was seen as, even though he was signed and still is, I believe, signed with Queensberry Promotions, he was seen as the away fighter, the underdog going into that. And the biggest compliment I can play the big man is he made an absolute mockery of those predictions and anyone backing against him. He showed his class, showed his power, showed his durability, his experience, whatever you want to say. He showed that in beating Dubois. Not only did he take the British title in that one, but also took a lot of the sort of world rankings, these fringe belts that I'm not going to focus on too much. But the position he's in, and yeah, I think he's 35, 36 years old now. He's worked his way up to that bottleneck towards the top of the heavyweight division. A bit up in the air is what's going to happen with that and all the belts. But he's well ranked with a lot of those sanctioning bodies. He's done things the right way. He's picked up the domestic titles. He's beaten domestic rivals. He's beaten, as I say, fringe world contenders. And he's put himself in a fantastic position so far in, as I said, well, you can see there on the screen, 13 fights. It's not to be sniffed at. And for that, I'm going to give Joe the Juggernaut Joyce a very favourable A. I think I've justified that in what he's done so far as a pro. I think he's very, very well positioned. He's underrated, I would say, by quite a few people still. It's not, he's not the flashiest necessarily. I know there's been a lot said about his his lack of charisma and personality outside of the ring. But these rankings, I'm judging this purely on what they've achieved in the ring. And to pick up the domestic titles that he's done, to put himself in that world position, he's, depending on what you read and what you believe, he's next in line, depending on the Usyk-Joshua rematch. Very well positioned with a few of the sanctioned bodies, but in particular the WBO. And he's in a little bit of a sort of dilemma at the minute, because you don't want him to be inactive. You don't want him to lose the momentum that, pardon the pun, he's built up as a juggernaut. He's getting that full head of steam, and you want to see him in competitive fights. It's now that risk against reward situation. There's other similarly ranked contenders, the likes of Joseph Parker, that would make excellent fights. Does he want to risk those sorts of fights? Are they worth the reward? Is he going to sit tight and wait for that world title shot? It'll be very interesting to see where he goes from here, just how much risk he wants to take. And hopefully for him, I think he gets that world title shot. He gets something that his career and his performances so far have deserved. But he's shown that he'll roll the dice. He's not afraid. And more importantly, I think his matchmakers and his promotional and management teams, they're not afraid to put him in with what you would sort of perceive as very tough challenges and tough tests for any other prospect. It seems bizarre talking about someone as experienced as Joe as a prospect, but after so few fights, he's still at that level. And to be considered some sort of prospect, but still be in the world title mix and be in the, I would argue quite confidently, in the top 10 at world level, like it's not to be sniffed at, and he deserves the praise, and that's why I've given him that fairly high ranking of an A. And from heavyweight, or from super heavyweight as the amateurs, we move down in weight, not by a massive amount, and we come to Lawrence Okolie. What more needs to be said about this man? Similarly to Joe Joyce, he's not had too many pro fights. It seems bizarre looking at him and sort of having followed his career from turning pro and seeing him live a few times during his sort of early stages, that he's still only had 17 fights, and what he has achieved in those 17 fights, adding in the fact that he's very limited as an amateur, was not necessarily the most experienced or seasoned boxer before turning pro, to have got to the Olympics in the first place, to then turn professional and achieve what he has achieved, is bordering on unbelievable. I think a lot of fans have taken a bit of time to warm to him, and some of his lesser performances sort of sit fresh in the mind. Of those 17 pro wins, 14 of them have come within inside the distance. And yet, if you speak to a lot of boxing fans, it's the ones that went the distance that are the sort of abiding standout memories of Lawrence Okolie. There was the domestic clash, sort of bitter rivalry with Isaac Chamberlain that headlined the O2, maybe a little bit too early for both men. There's a lot of pressure on them, especially as a young, inexperienced fighter. Lawrence got the job done. It wasn't the tidiest of fights, but when that's your big chance, your big statement win, it left a little bit of an underwhelming feeling with a lot of fans and a lot of viewers. Follow that up not too long after with the Matty Askin performance. Again, another win, another W on the record, but another underwhelming, dare I say, not the most satisfying win for him, despite picking up the British title. From that point on, Okolie's never looked back. He's been absolutely sensational. He's put together, I think, 6 or 7 stoppage wins and looked devastating doing it. In amongst that, there's been the change of trainer to Shane McGuigan, someone I rate very, very highly, and I know many others do. Hopefully adding a bit more to Lawrence. Maybe Lawrence has learned himself from those earlier performances and the fights, and he's starting now to use his reach and his size and his power a little bit more effectively. Got to give credit to Shane for that as well, I suppose, as well as Lawrence himself. He's done exactly what anyone watching boxing wants a fighter to do. Already mentioned the British. He's a Commonwealth champion as well. He's then gone on and absolutely smashed his way to the European title. And of course, most recently, become a world champion in what is a very competitive division. He picked up the WBO title again, absolutely dismantling his opponent, Buatsi, on the night there. He's had one defence, I think. He's got another one coming up. And he's in the unfortunate, I dare say, position of being in a cruiserweight division where there are a lot of tough fighters, but very few big names. And some of his defences, if he's going to hang around at the 200-pound division, they're not going to be the most glamorous of fights, and they're not going to be necessarily the easiest to sell. But from what he's done and the way he fights and what he brings, his presence, his ability, and ultimately that knockout power, he's a genuine headliner in the making. Now, I'm not one to advocate pushing people to pay-per-view and encouraging fans to pay more, but in terms of what he brings in the ring, what he delivers, the way he fights, and say some of the matches out there for him, that they're going to be good fights. He's going to, sounds a bit silly with some of the previous outings I've just talked about there, but he's going to bring entertainment. I think he's mixing it up. He's showing that he can deliver the knockout, he can deliver a finish, he can stop opponents, and that's a huge thing in terms of building the appeal of a fighter. Obviously, you're looking now as a world champion, despite having fewer than 20 fights, at these unifications. Like, is he going to fight Maurice Bradis? And it's definitely a fight in the making. There's been mentions of it. I don't know how serious the negotiations have been, but it's one of those. It's one of those fights that is mouth-watering as a boxing fan. Like, it might not appeal to the mass casual audience and those who don't necessarily know who Okolie is, tucked away on DAZN now rather than being on Sky Sports. But in terms of a boxing fan, if you are tuning in for the sport, for the competitive fights, for the high-level action, Okolie's well positioned now within that, and to do it, as I say, is not the most experienced amateur fighter, someone who is, we hear it all the time, learning on the job. And he's done that. He's learned on the job whilst being fast-tracked to a degree. There's obviously talk from his promoter that he's been avoided by a few of these fighters, but what he's done is he's done things the right way. He's picked up wins at domestic level against domestic rivals, won a European title, the EBU European title, for anyone who's not sure. That's like the genuine one, not one of these fringe world organisation ones that get offered about. And then a genuine world title. Now, there will be his critics because of the previous performances, because of maybe the lack of actual depth and quality names on his record. But from a fighter, he's done everything that's been asked of him. And his was the name that, when I put this out on Twitter, got a lot of praise. He's the biggest achiever of this class of 2016. And for that, I can't give him anything less than an A+. I would argue till I'm blue in the face for anyone that wants to knock him down on that ranking. I think that grade is fair. It's a fair reflection of what he's achieved so far. And if we're then looking beyond, and he's still got that potential to achieve even more a cruiserweight and physically fill out as a heavyweight and cause a lot of problems for, I'd say, the next generation of heavyweights once those titles get scattered and there's a bit of a free-for-all. And the next few years, very exciting indeed for Lawrence Okolie. Working our way down the weights, we come to the light heavyweight prospect, Joshua JB Buatsi, another undefeated Rio Olympian as a pro, similar amount of fights to the previous two I've discussed. And if we sort of class that British title as the bare minimum for what we expect these Olympians, these elite amateurs to achieve, he's ticked that box as well. He's built up a solid resume. He's a fighter that there was an awful lot of hype and excitement about. I think earlier on, when they're all sort of battling on these shows to try and separate themselves from their peers, Buatsi was the one who stood out. A lot of people were very, very high on him indeed. And it's almost seems a bit hypercritical to try and pick fault in him, but I think because of how good he is and how early he won the British title in his career, it's very easy to sort of look down on his almost lack of momentum. There's one or two maybe underwhelming performances in there recently, but he's come back, and again, I can sit here and talk about injuries, and there's all sorts of circumstances and things going on outside the ring, especially in the last couple of years with the pandemic and everything we know about the schedule of boxing and how that's been impacted. Just focusing on what is in the ring, I'd like to have seen him progress that little bit further. He got a good win against Ricard Blotniks last time out. No easy task. It's almost that lose-lose type of fight. If you don't look good against him, he's got a few losses on his record. It doesn't necessarily look the best, but he controlled that fight. He was in charge. He used his speed, his skill, his power, and ultimately got the stoppage as well. It's a nice little punctuation, nice little reminder of everyone of just what Joshua Buatsi is capable of. Similarly to Okolie, he's in a division where there are some very, very tough fights, especially as you get towards that world level. And obviously with the bigger men, the bigger fighters, there is more physical danger as well. There's some very heavy punches in there. You're looking at the likes of Bivol, likes of Gavodzic, who's maybe past his best. He might have announced he's done now. But you're looking around that sort of level, in and around that level. Joe Smith Jr. obviously is a world champion as well. I know there's talk of him unifying with Canelo stepping into the mix at 175, and I say unifying, you know what I mean, like defending his title against Canelo, who's obviously champion at the lower weights. And there's all of these sorts of fighters who are in and around there that I would like to see him progress to. I don't know whether he needs maybe that little bit more momentum, build it up before he gets into that and he forces himself into the world title mix. He's not necessarily going to get that voluntary defence. I don't think any of the champions are going to be looking at him and thinking that risk is worth the reward. He's a very capable fighter. He maybe needs that round European level, I suppose, and fringe world level, getting some names on his record that are going to make people sit and stand up and help rebuild that early hype that was in his career. So while he's done nothing necessarily wrong himself as a professional, I don't think he's done anything to justify getting into the A or the A+ bracket. And for that reason, I'm going to settle on a B for Buatsi. Moving on from Joshua Buatsi, we look down to a middleweight. And it was middleweight as an amateur. Anthony Fowler turned professional in the super welterweight or junior middle in old money division, £154. And I dare say this lad is going to split opinion like no other from the group of 2016 Rio Olympian boxers. There is something about him that just drives people mad, whether you're in favour of him, whether you're not, whether it's what he's doing in the ring, whether it's his chat at the press conferences outside of the ring, his, shall we say, advertising and sponsorship on social media, his presence online. There is something about him that rubs people up the wrong way. And I'm going to say I'm not one of them. I don't necessarily find him to be this cocky, arrogant personality that many people seem to do. From my dealings with him online and in press conferences, etc., he comes across as someone who's, confident in his ability, definitely, but tell me a pro boxer that's going to make success in a career that isn't confident. You have to have that self-belief, almost delusion, to believe that you are better than everybody else on the planet. And while Anthony hasn't necessarily proven that as a professional, I don't see anything wrong with having that level of self-confidence and the unwavering belief that you are going to achieve something significant. So from that point of view, his personality doesn't put me off him whatsoever. Where I would say there have been the limits is in the ring itself. And this might sound a little bit harsh for someone who, again, has had less than fewer than 20 fights like his peers. It's hard to judge someone on the losses, and I'm not really one to sort of say, oh, well, he's lost, therefore that's sort of something to really beat him, like a stick to really beat a boxer with. If you're getting matched competitively and you're in tough fights, there's a chance you're going to lose them. It's how you respond and how you come back from that that's going to define you. With that said, I don't think Anthony Fowler has responded particularly strongly. I don't think he's done anything following, say, for example, the Scott Fitzgerald loss to say, right, I'm right back in this mix. And obviously his most recent outing against Liam Smith. No shame in losing to any of those two fighters as a British level boxer. They're both very, very good fighters. Yet, I think if you judge Anthony on his best win, then there's a little bit of a lack of depth to that. I think maybe Brian Rose in terms of name value, even though he was very, very far past his best. That's probably the biggest win Fowler has. He was pushed, I'm not going to say too early, because again, he's a very experienced amateur. He's getting fast-tracked to a degree. But the Scott Fitzgerald fight, I think, took a lot out of him emotionally. He was very, very heavily, and dare I say, over-invested in that one. And for him not to do the job as he anticipated, maybe just took him that little bit of time to recover. He struggled. Obviously, he's since changed trainer, moving from Dave Caldwell. And I think with that in mind, it's a very hard one for him to define, a very hard one to judge just where he's at. Very, very close competitive fight with Fitzgerald, who went on to win the British title. So you can definitely argue that despite not winning a British title, Fowler is at British level at least. The Liam Smith fight I was ringside for, very, very competitive against a fringe world level boxer, but ultimately fell short once again. And at his age, at this point in his career, very interested to see where he goes. Strong rumours, I think he may even have confirmed himself that he's going to be moving up in weight to middleweight. We often hear about this and how fighters have forced themselves and killed themselves to make a certain weight. They go up, and even though it's £6 difference, it can mean the world to a fighter. Cutting those last few pounds at the end of a tough, grueling camp can be the difference between winning and losing, can be the difference between an exceptional performance and a very, very weak performance. What I would say, though, with Fowler and the Smith fight, it wasn't a weak performance by any means. Fowler was boxing very, very well for large parts of that fight. He just was beaten by the better man on the night, or dare I say the more determined fighter. Smith just was not going to lose that night. And then Fowler to sort of look towards the physical side of things, it may be that he's reinvigorated up at 160. At middleweight, he goes on a bit of a tear. I'd be very interested to see what level he comes in at 160, probably a few tune-up fights, a few warm-up fights, and look to build himself back to where he feels he belongs. Where that is between sort of British and world level, I'm not quite sure where he fits in, and it'll be interesting to see how he copes with the bigger punchers, the bigger men, the stronger men up at middleweight. However, I'm not going to give him his grade based on where I think he's going to score, what I think he's going to achieve. I'm just looking at those 15 wins, those 2 losses, the level of competition he's beaten. And as I say, I'm not going to discredit him too much for the losses, but based on the fighters that he has beat in the ring so far at this point in 2022, I'm grading Anthony Fowler's pro career so far as a D. Moving from Anthony Fowler at middleweight to another middleweight who seemingly went under the radar for many when I put this one out asking who's had a success. Savannah Marshall did not get a single mention, which is an absolute disgrace. Despite the lack of, I want to say, profile probably of women's boxing, if you are just looking at it, she is probably pound for pound one of the best fighters as a professional from that 2016 squad. 11-0. I'm not going to read too much into that in terms of the level of competition she's faced or hasn't faced, but she has done absolutely everything expected of her as a professional. And there are many female boxers who can do that. Anyone with a sort of decent amateur pedigree, because of the relative lack of depth in the women's sport at the moment, these records can build themselves very, very quickly. There's no one Savannah has faced that I've expected to pose any problems, and that is down to her ability. That is a credit to her and what she brings to the professional ranks. As a professional boxer, a professional female boxer, Savannah Marshall sets herself apart from her peers. She not only has the skills and the style to pose problems to anyone in the world, she also has the power as well. It sounds very basic and very crude just to differentiate a fighter on that, but when you are in a division, and this could be heavyweight, this could be lightweight, this could be featherweight, this could be whatever, whether it's male, female, whichever division you are boxing in, if you are bringing genuine knockout power and excitement to your fights, that is going to help build your profile. That is going to help build a following and create a bit of hype around you and generate huge amounts of interest. Now, being a bit of a promotional sort of roller coaster with Savannah, similarly to Joyce actually, which I didn't mention in his little section, but there's sort of dotted around the different promotional entities, being on a few platforms already, despite having very few professional fights. She seems settled now as part of the Boxer and Sky Sports link. Obviously made an appearance on Soccer AM quite recently to sort of help boost her performance, not performance, but boost her profile. And I did say earlier on that I was just going to stick to things in the ring. So I am going to do that. But the reason I mention these sorts of things in the publicity outside the ring with Savannah is because her performances in the ring warrant that. I think she could be the shining star of the female sport. Katie Taylor obviously has done huge amounts for that in recent years. I was going to include the Irish in this, but I thought I'll leave it out just to avoid a bit of trolling accusations. Don't want to be tagging the Irish in with Team GB and British Boxing Blog. But Savannah is well positioned to take over the reins from that. Obviously, there's a huge clash on the horizon with Clarissa Shields, someone she beat as an amateur. That one seems to have a bit of momentum now with Sky Sports. So bringing bringing Shields over to box. I no doubt that Marshall will be there ringside, something, getting involved. They'll have something to do that to try and generate it. I think that's a huge fight, and if Savannah gets that signature win on her record, then that'll elevate her to an A+. But for now, I'm going to settle with an A for Savannah Marshall. From one Northeast professional to another, we have Josh Pretty Boy Kelly, the welterweight representative in Rio 2016, welterweight as a professional. First thing I say is welterweight Commonwealth champion. So definitely has achieved something that puts him at a decent level already. And again, I was actually surprised and shocked when I looked at it and did a bit of research into Josh. Someone I'm fairly familiar with anyway. But I was a little surprised at how few fights he's had. As a professional, because of the speed and the pace at which they've worked him. As I say, picked up the Commonwealth title with fewer than 10 fights on his record. That's an achievement in himself. He seems to be another slightly divisive character, maybe because of the sort of hype that we've had around him. I know his trainer, Adam Booth, has described him as one of, if not the most talented prospects and talented boxers he's ever worked with. High praise indeed when you consider some of the names that Booth has trained, like some Mick Conlon, George Groves, David Hay going further back. From that point of view, fans are really then expectant of seeing something special in the ring. And I think Kelly's provided glimpses of that. He's definitely shown flashes of his brilliance, but not anywhere near consistently enough to warrant such praise as yet. If they say you're only as good as your most recent fight, this is where he maybe falls away slightly. Most people, most boxing fans, have his previous outing, the stoppage loss to David Evanesian, fresh, very, very fresh in their minds. So from that, I think it's easy to say why he's maybe underperformed as a professional. But what a lot of people tend to forget is sort of how young he is. He's sort of getting into that mid to late 20s point of view now. And I can't exactly, 22 back in maybe he's a little older than I thought. 22 back in Rio 16. So yeah, he's sort of talking 6 years on, getting to that point where you want to see him in these fights. But for whatever reason, he hasn't really built up that record in terms of just staying active and getting out there. Fighting for a European title after like less than 15 fights is quite a task. And I think a lot of people now very, very quick to say it came too early for him. But I was one backing Josh in that going into that contest. I thought it was going to be a big ask. Avanesian is a very classy operator, a very tough competitor, but I thought Josh would have enough in terms of his skill and his speed to maybe edge it on the cards. See, that wasn't to be. He showed even in that fight he was controlling certain rounds, but it's all irrelevant. Like, there's no point winning 5 rounds if you get knocked out in the 6th. I don't want to dismiss Josh though, because whatever he decides to do now, it seems like it's been ages since that fight, and we haven't seen or heard much from him since. rumours going up to 154 super welterweight. Similarly to Fowler, it's often very easy, or it's more obviously highlighted after a loss that there's problems making the weight, there's issues cutting those final few pounds. Similarly to Fowler, we'll see just exactly where he stands, where the land lies with Josh Kelly if he does come back at that higher weight. I'm not convinced, similar with Anthony Fowler, I'm not convinced that mixing it with the bigger, stronger guys up with that higher weight class will do him any favours, but we may see a reinvigorated, a more confident, a fresher performance from Kelly. I'm going to give him a bit of leeway, and not just because he's from the northeast. If anything, with this top on, I'll do the Kieran Trippier point in my sleeve. With a Newcastle top on, I should be even harsher on Josh than I am on anyone with being from Sunderland. But I'm going to settle with a C for Kelly because, as I say, I think there's no shame in losing to someone like Avanesian. There's the Commonwealth title that he has picked up. I think that's just tipped him to a C for me, and I dare say there'll be a bit of controversy and a bit of discussion about that one. On to the lightweight representative from Team GB 2016 Rio Olympics. Lightweight as a professional initially, he's since made the bizarre change. He actually picked up the British title as a lightweight, some very good domestic wins, beating the likes of Andy Townend, Gavin Gwynn at lightweight, and they're not to be sniffed at. Again, if you're a young, decent prospect, and I want to reiterate this because I feel that when it's Matchroom in particular, when they sign an Olympian, there's a lot of hype and a lot of promotional push behind them that people expect them all to be on this sort of Lomachenko trajectory of a couple of fights, 5 fights, getting for a British title, 10 fights European, and beyond that, the world honours by the time they've had, like Cordina has, 14 fights or so. And it's unrealistic. It's not necessarily fair. So for someone, again, with just 14 fights, obviously he had fewer than that when he won the British title, it's a hell of an achievement. He's done exceptionally well to get that point of view. And I think a lot of fans see the British as a sort of minimum for these guys. And I mentioned that earlier in this piece. I understand that because they're, in theory, amongst the best amateurs in the world, so they should be getting in for world titles, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And I feel really hard to criticise Cordina for only having won that British title so far. This is, again, someone who's not had that many fights as a professional. He's come back, as I said, winning the lightweight title, and then in his very next outing made that decision to drop down to super feather. So we've talked already, or I've talked about Kelly, Fowler. They've lost and then made the decision to go up in weight. That seems to be a very common thing in boxing. They're looking for any sort of, not excuse, but any reason or any factor that might have contributed to the loss rather than being beaten by the better man. It's very hard for boxers to just admit that and move on. There has to be this inquest, there has to be digging into what exactly has gone wrong, what can I do to tweak my performance and to improve myself the next time out. So for Cordina to come off winning the British title and then sit down with his team and think, actually, I'm going to be even better at a lower weight, it's an interesting development. And again, he's fought, obviously he's beaten everyone he's boxed. So to then go down to super feather and continue that momentum. He's one who I think suffered a little with the pandemic and issues outside the ring, not been as active since, but come back recently towards the end of last year, and I think the Conor Benn undercard picked up another win. These sort of international level fights, they're really hard to judge because unless you're an encyclopedic knowledge or encyclopedic expert of boxing, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know a lot about his recent opponents, but he's picked up the wins. He's doing what needs to be done, and I think coming into 2022, he's going to want to be active. He's going to want to get out as often as possible, and hopefully make that progression. I think a European title shot is going to be something that is in the works for Joe Cordina, something that we'll look to see him working towards world level, whether it's actually sort of boxing for the European title or going down one of the sanctioning body routes, something more directly, following on from some of these international fights that he's had, these international titles he's picked up, and positioning himself at world level. But again, one fighter who's done nothing wrong so far, and it feels very, very critical and nitpicking to sort of pick him up on the lack of momentum he's had and the lack of activity he's had, because when he's been in the ring, he has done the business so far. And with that, I am going to grant Joe Cordina a B. And from our lightweight / super featherweight, we work our way down to Qais Ashfaq, another very, very talented boxer. And that sounds really, really obvious when we are talking about these Olympians and obviously the boxers who have reached the pinnacle of the amateur game. I think the most generous praise I can give Qais is when I've seen him box, he looks very, very tidy. He's a very, very skillful operator. I think to describe his pro career so far as underwhelming is probably fair. When you've had 10 fights as a pro, and again, it's definitely this matchroom, this home prospect thing of pressure and scrutiny, because we're so used to, as boxing fans, we are so ingrained to seeing prospects put in fights they're expected to win. They're learning fights. They're fights that don't really pose any risk to them. So from that point of view, you've got to give them credit for fighting someone like a Mark Leach, who's sort of, I think, 12, 13 wins at the time, like a decent winning record. I loathe to say it was too early for Ashfaq, because it was a fight that he was expected to win. It was a tough fight, and it's one of those that, in hindsight, was obviously too tough for him at the time. But despite the pre-fight protestations from the promoter and anyone trying to build the hype and build the fight and generate some interest, this is a real 50-50, it's a domestic dust-up. I don't think too many people would have thought that until the result and the fight played out. It's really difficult then to sort of grade this fighter too highly, because I think Qais Ashfaq is very, very talented. He's another one who's maybe lacked that momentum. You can see there he's only had 10 fights since 2016. Now, not necessarily these fighters, a little disclaimer, they obviously didn't all turn professional straight after the Olympic Games. But when you've had as few fights as that, a loss so early on almost seems that little bit more significant. Now, he could go on and win his next 10 fights convincingly, put himself right in the mix at world title level. But for whatever reason it is, he doesn't seem to have really made his mark on the professional ranks. As I say, underwhelming so far for someone so talented. And a D sounds absolutely brutal. It sounds really, really harsh. But again, if you're judging a fighter based on his sole loss, in this case, and his best wins, there's nothing that really stands out on his record, and nothing that sort of says this guy is at that high level, is at the level that we maybe unrealistically expect from anyone who's boxed in the Olympics. And I regrettably, as he's a nice lad, I regrettably give him a D. On to our next contender. So we're moving right down the weight classes now. Muhammad Ali, I'm dying to say it, remember the name. But apart from that, he hasn't really, unfortunately for him, had a lot going for him. Now, the pro record, 3-0. If I'm basing this, as I've tried to say, I'm breaking my own criteria. If I base this on what he's achieved so far in the ring, he's had 3 pretty underwhelming wins. From 3-0, he's undefeated, 100% record. He's done nothing wrong in the ring in that regard. However, it would be remiss not to dig a little deeper and explain, for those who maybe aren't aware, why it's only been the 3 professional fights since the 2016 Olympics. For anyone who's not aware, Muhammad Ali tested positive for a banned substance, was subsequently suspended. This was whilst still an amateur boxing in the WSB World Series of Boxing. I've heard conflicting reports and excuses basically for this. I've been advised that he was very, very poorly advised by someone sort of close to him, close to him, but not within boxing as such. So he's paid the price for that with his suspension. He's since turned pro. He's making starts and making steps towards that sort of some level of success. But for having all the potential in the world, I can't judge this on hypothetical what he is going to achieve. I'm judging it right now, beginning of 2022, what he's done so far, and for that reason, I can't really. And I never thought when I started BBB, never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be grading someone called Muhammad Ali so poorly. Sorry, Muhammad, but it is an F from a BBB. And last but not least, we are moving on now to the lioness herself, Nicola Adams. Professional career record of 5 wins, 0 losses and 1 draw in her last ever boxing bout. Where to start with this woman? As an amateur, sensational, absolutely fantastic achievements, and along with the likes of Katie Taylor, really helped generate interest, significant interest in the female boxing world, I suppose. There's no other way to put it. But this is not about that. This is not about amateur achievements. This is solely basing things on professional record. It seems so few fights for someone so experienced. It's not necessarily unheard of for someone who's so experienced and boxed so many competitive bouts as an amateur to then maybe not have the longevity as a professional. But if we look at that last fight, the draw, Adams then cut her professional career short. Obviously injuries, things like this, they all add up over the years and years of dedicating yourself to the sport. Well worth pointing out, within those 5 wins, she picked up a world title. So achieved what we'd, and this is ridiculous, but the world title was the absolute minimum for Nicola Adams as a professional, and she achieved that. I think I could be here all day, as I say, gushing over her achievements in and out the ring, the impact that she's had on the sport, but just solely judging it on what she achieved in the ring, I feel harsh, I feel critical, I feel very, very picky to sort of reiterate and go over again the lack of depth in the sort of divisions where she's boxing, but I can't ask for more. She's, whatever sport you are competing at, to win a world title in less than half a dozen bouts is a good achievement. And I say good, it's better than good, but there'll be some people in the comments slagging it off. They'll be belittling what she's done, but I genuinely can't do any more or less. I can't justify just on, if this was amateur and professional combined, A+ all the way. Absolutely fantastic. As a professional, I've got to sort of look a little bit more critically, and for that reason, I've settled on an A- for Nicola Adams. I feel she had the potential to be multiple weight world champion. Whether she turned pro too late, if she'd done it a little bit earlier, would she have had that longevity? Would she have had, the chance to move through the weights, picking up the belts, and really leave that long-lasting impression on the professional ranks to match her amateur achievements? Maybe. It's all hypothetical, I suppose, with that sort of debate. But I think A-, a fair result. She's done what she needed to do as a professional. She can leave the sport with her head held very, very highly, and a huge amount of respect from all involved. I hope that anyone who has lasted the course, lasted the duration, has enjoyed my little analysis of each of the members of the Rio 2016 Team GB boxing squad. I'm sure there'll be grades that you disagree with, as I say, and I've mentioned throughout the video. Drop your comments in below. Let me know if you agree. Let me know if you disagree. If you think I'm talking sense, there might be a few of you out there. If you don't think I'm talking absolute rubbish, let me know as well. Don't forget to give us a like, give us a subscribe. We're really trying to boost our YouTube presence this year in 2022. It's our New Year's resolution. We love the support that we get on all our social media platforms, and we hope it continues. Thank you very much.